Some loves arrive loudly, crashing into your life with chaos and certainty, announcing themselves like storms you can see from miles away. But the most dangerous kind, the ones that change you forever, often begin quietly. So quietly that you don't even realize they've entered your life until they've already taken root somewhere deep inside you, somewhere you never meant to open. This love was never meant to be found. It didn't come with intention. It didn't come with longing or hope or the kind of desire people write about. It arrived disguised as something harmless, something ordinary, something forgettable. And because of that, it slipped past every defense, every boundary, every promise made itself about what would never be allowed. At first, it felt like nothing at all. Life at that time was structured, predictable, carefully controlled. Each day followed the one before it with mechanical precision. Wake up, survive the day, return home carrying the weight of obligations, expectations, and responsibilities that left little room for emotional curiosity. There was no searching for love, no hunger for connection, no open door waiting to be filled. The heart had already decided it was full, or at least closed enough to avoid disappointment. And that was exactly why this love succeeded. It didn't knock. It didn't ask permission. It didn't declare itself. It simply existed, subtly, persistently, like a thought you don't remember thinking for the first time, but somehow can't stop returning to. It showed up in moments that didn't matter, and stayed long enough to make them matter later. At the beginning, it was nothing more than awareness. Awareness of presence. Awareness of consistency. Awareness of a particular kind of calm that followed certain interactions. Not excitement. Not butterflies. Just a quiet steadiness that felt unfamiliar in a world that usually demanded emotional effort. The mind noticed it before the heart did, filed it away as unimportant, and moved on. Or at least, it thought it did. But awareness has a way of growing when ignored. The more it was dismissed, the more it lingered. The more it lingered, the more it softened the edges of routine. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to change. Moments that were once neutral began to carry weight. Thoughts that had no reason to return began to repeat themselves. And without realizing it, attention started bending in one direction. Still, it didn't feel like love. Love was supposed to be dramatic. Love was supposed to be chosen. Love was supposed to arrive with certainty, with clarity, with permission. This felt nothing like that. This felt like familiarity forming too quickly, like comfort developing without explanation, like understanding that hadn't been earned but somehow existed anyway. And because it didn't match the definition of love, it wasn't treated as dangerous. That was a mistake. Days passed, then weeks. Time did what it always does, turn small things into habits. The presence that once barely registered became expected. The absence of it became noticeable. And somewhere along the way, the realization arrived quietly, like a truth whispered instead of spoken. Something was happening, not externally. Nothing had changed in a way the world could see. But internally, there was a subtle shift, a reorientation of emotional gravity. Thoughts began orbiting around the same point. Feelings that had no name began asking for one. And the heart, which it swore was unavailable, started paying attention in ways it hadn't planned for. This was the stage where denial took over. It was easy to explain everything away. It was easy to label feeling as appreciation, respect, curiosity. Anything but what it was slowly becoming. After all, nothing inappropriate had occurred. Nothing dramatic had happened. There were no stolen moments, no confessions, no lines crossed. And yet, the emotional landscape had already changed. That's how forbidden things usually begin, not with action, but with permission given silently. The permission to think a little longer than necessary. The permission to feel understood without asking why. The permission to look forward to something that should have been neutral. And once permission is granted, even unintentionally, the heart begins its quiet rebellion. The most unsettling part wasn't the attraction, it was a recognition. That rare and frightening sense of being seen without trying, of being understood without explanation, of having someone intuitively grasp parts of you that you never put into words, parts you didn't even know how to articulate yourself. That kind of connection doesn't announce itself as love. It announces itself as relief. Relief from performing. Relief from explaining. Relief from pretending you are simpler than you are. And relief is addictive. Still, the mind resisted. It reminded itself of boundaries, of reality, of all the reasons this connection should remain exactly what it was and nothing more. It reminded itself that not every meaningful bond is meant to deepen, that not every emotional alignment is an invitation. But the heart doesn't respond to logic. It responds to resonance. And resonance was already there. By the time the realization arrived that this wasn't harmless, that this wasn't accidental, that this wasn't something that could be easily undone, it was already too late to pretend nothing existed. The connection had crossed an invisible threshold, one that cannot be uncrossed once passed. This was the moment the love should have been buried. This was the moment it should have been acknowledged and dismissed, cut off before it grew teeth, locked away before it learned how to ache. But the problem with loves that aren't meant to be found is that they don't announce themselves in time for prevention. They reveal themselves only after they've already changed you, and change had already begun. There was a new sensitivity now, a heightened awareness of emotional undercurrents, a quiet anticipation that lived beneath the surface of ordinary days. The world hadn't shifted, but the internal experience had. Everything felt slightly more vivid, slightly more fragile, and with that came fear. Fear of what this meant, fear of where this could lead, fear of the quiet truth forming beneath all the rational explanations. Because if this was love, real love, deep love, the kind that roots itself in the soul, then it posed a question that had no easy answer. What happens when you find a love you were never meant to discover? At this stage, nothing had been said, nothing had been done, and yet the emotional stakes were already impossibly high. The heart had recognized something rare, and recognition alone was enough to alter its course. This wasn't a love story that began with hope. It began with hesitation, with the growing awareness that some connections are powerful precisely because they are not supposed to exist, that some loves don't ask to be chosen, they simply demand to be acknowledged. And deep down, beneath all the resistance, there was already a devastating truth taking shape. This love, once found, would not leave quietly. It would either be denied at great personal cost, or allowed to grow into something that would eventually break everything it touched. And the most painful part? No matter which choice would be made, nothing would ever return to the way it was before. Because the moment this love was found, truly found, innocence was already lost. The most dangerous phase of an unmet love is not discovery. It is acceptance. Not acceptance in the sense of surrender, but acceptance of presence. The quiet decision, often made without words, to stop pretending the feeling does not exist and instead allow it to occupy space. Once that happens, the heart begins to negotiate terms it will eventually break. By the time awareness had settled into certainty, the love had already changed shape. It was no longer a distant emotional hum that could be ignored. It had become a steady presence, woven into thought patterns, emotional reactions, and the rhythm of ordinary days. It was no longer just something noticed. It was something felt, and feeling, once acknowledged, demands attention. The mind tried to keep the feeling contained, tried to assign it boundaries that could be respected. It told itself this was simply a human response to familiarity, to kindness, to understanding. It reminded itself that closeness does not automatically mean desire, that emotional alignment does not have to evolve into longing. But the heart doesn't measure in definitions. It measures in absence. And absence had begun to matter. There were moments, small, forgettable moments, where the presence that had become expected was missing. And in those moments, something unmistakable surfaced. A quiet discomfort, an unease that had nothing to do with logic. It was a realization that something essential had briefly disappeared. And the body had noticed before the mind could explain why. That was the first sign of wanting. Wanting didn't arrive as craving or desperation. It arrived as preference, as subtle prioritization, as the unconscious inclination to orient attention in one direction rather than another. It was in the way time felt slightly more generous when connection was near and slightly heavier when it wasn't. Wanting hid itself well. It disguised itself as concern, as interest, as curiosity. It framed itself as care that was still appropriate, still safe, still within reason. But beneath those surface explanations was a quieter truth. The emotional bond had deepened beyond neutrality, and the heart had begun to hope without admitting it. Hope is treacherous when it isn't supposed to exist. The heart began to imagine, not future plans or fantasies, but emotional continuities. The idea that this presence would remain constant, that this understanding would continue uninterrupted, that this quiet alignment would always be available in the same way, with the same ease. That was the illusion, because loves that are never meant to be found are not built for permanence. They exist in fragile conditions, dependent on restraint, silence, and a careful avoidance of truth. The moment expectation enters, the structure begins to weaken. Still, the heart persisted. It began to lean into the connection emotionally, even as it outwardly maintained distance. It began to read meaning into subtleties, to hold on to moments longer than necessary, to revisit interactions in memory and find new layers each time. This was an obsession. It was attunement, the kind that develops when two emotional frequencies align too closely. And alignment creates vulnerability. There was a growing sensitivity now, not just the presence and absence, but the tone, energy, and emotional shifts. Small changes were noticed, small differences registered. The heart had begun tracking something it had no right to monitor, and in doing so, it placed itself in a position of quiet dependence. Dependence doesn't always look like need. Sometimes it looks like adjustment, like subtly shaping emotional states around someone else's presence, like unconsciously calibrating moods based on proximity, like feeling steadier, calmer, more whole when the connection was active, and slightly unbalanced when it wasn't. This was the stage where restraint became difficult, not because of temptation, but because of emotional honesty. The desire to acknowledge what was already obvious internally. The desire to speak the truth, not to change anything, but simply to release the pressure of holding it in. But truth, once spoken, demands consequence. And consequence was something the heart was not prepared to face. So silence continued. But silence has its own weight. Unspoken feelings don't disappear. They compress. They settle deeper into the emotional core, gaining intensity as they remain unexpressed. Over time, what could have been a passing connection began to feel significant, irreplaceable, and dangerously meaningful. The heart began to fear loss before loss had occurred. It imagined a connection ending, not dramatically, but quietly, the way things often do when they were never meant to be permanent. And the thought of that ending carried an unexpected ache, one that revealed the depth of attachment that had formed without consent. This was no longer just about liking. This was about attachment. Attachment forms when emotional safety is found, when a person becomes a place of rest rather than stimulation, when connection feels less like excitement and more like grounding. That kind of bond does not ask permission. It simply forms. And once formed, it resists reason. There was an internal conflict now, a constant negotiation between what was felt and what was allowed, between desire and discipline, between the heart's pull and the mind's restraint. Each interaction became layered with unspoken meaning, each moment heavy with what could not be acknowledged. This tension was exhausting, yet, strangely, it was also intoxicating. There was something powerful about caring deeply while remaining composed, about feeling intensely while appearing unaffected. It created a sense of emotional depth, of inner complexity, of carrying something sacred and secret. But secrets, even sacred ones, demand a price. The price was emotional vulnerability without relief, wanting without permission, attachment without security. It was loving in isolation, without the comfort being known in that love. And slowly, quietly, the heart began to ask a dangerous question. What if this love was worth the risk? Not worth acting on, but worth holding, worth protecting, worth enduring. Even if it could never be fulfilled, the heart began to romanticize restraint, to frame suffering as proof of depth, to believe that silent love was somehow purer than love that demanded expression. This belief was both beautiful and destructive, because love, by its nature, seeks movement. It wants to grow, to expand, to be acknowledged. When denied that movement, it doesn't stay still. it turns inward. And inward love has a way of reshaping identity, priorities, and emotional resilience. By the end of this phase, something irreversible had occurred. The love was no longer accidental. The wanting was no longer deniable. And the heart, whether it admitted it or not, had already crossed a line. This love had been found. Not fully acknowledged, not spoken, not acted upon, but found in the deepest sense of the word. Recognized as something real, something rare, something that would leave a mark regardless of its outcome. And that recognition carried a devastating implication. Once you want what you were never meant to find, walking away is no longer just a choice. It becomes a loss. There is a specific kind of loneliness that only exists when you are not alone. It does not come from absence, but from presence that cannot be fully reached, from connection that exists just close enough to touch, yet too far to claim. This is a loneliness of loving in silence, and by the time it settled in, it had already reshaped everything. Silence was no longer neutral. It had become an active force, something that required effort to maintain. Every interaction carried the weight of what was not said. Every shared moment existed on two levels, the surface exchange and the deeper emotional undercurrent that pulsed beneath it. The heart was no longer just feeling. It was managing expressions, managing reactions, managing the constant urge to reveal what was carefully hidden. Loving in silence demanded discipline, and discipline demanded sacrifice. The sacrifice was honesty, not dishonesty in words, but dishonesty in omission, the daily choice to withhold emotional truth for the sake of preserving structure, stability, and the fragile equilibrium that allowed the connection to exist at all. The heart learned to speak fluently in restraint, to translate longing into neutrality, affection into composure. But the body always knows. It knows when attention lingers too long. It knows when absence carries weight. It knows when emotional proximity has crossed into territory the mind refuses to name. And so the silence became heavier, not because the love grew louder, but because the effort to contain it grew exhausting. There were moments when a heart felt dangerously close to spilling over, not through grand confession, but through subtle shifts, a softness that lingered too long, an attentiveness that exceeded expectation, a presence that felt less like coincidence and more like intention. Each of these moments triggered fear. Fear not of rejection, but of exposure. Exposure would mean confrontation with reality, with consequences, with the undeniable truth that this connection had evolved beyond what could be safely contained. Exposure would force a reckoning, and reckoning would demand a decision that neither the heart nor the mind was ready to make. So the silence deepened, and within that silence, love continued to grow, quietly, patiently, painfully. The strange thing about unspoken love is that it becomes more vivid in imagination than it ever could be in reality. Without the grounding of expression, the heart fills in gaps, idealizes intentions, amplifies meaning. The connection becomes larger than life, precisely because it is not tested by real-world vulnerability. This made the love feel both profound and fragile. Profound because it existed untouched by conflict or disappointment. Fragile because it relied entirely on restraint to survive. The heart became hyper-aware of this fragility. Every interaction carried the unspoken risk of change. A single misstep could alter the balance. A single honest moment could unravel everything that had been carefully maintained. And so the heart learned to live in a constant state of vigilance, guarding not just a connection, but itself. This vigilance had a cost. Joy became muted. Spontaneity faded. Emotional expression was filtered through layers of self-monitoring. Even happiness felt cautious, as though too much of it might give something away. The love was alive, but it was contained in a way that denied it oxygen. And yet, letting it die felt impossible, because in the quiet, the love felt real, deeply real. It felt like a rare alignment, the kind that doesn't come often in a lifetime. It felt like recognition at a soul level, the kind that leaves an imprint even if it is never acted upon. This belief sustained the silence. The heart told itself that loving quietly was noble, that restraint was proof of maturity, that protecting connection, even in its limited form, was better than risking its destruction. It told itself that not all loves are meant to be lived out loud. But beneath that justification was grief. Grief for a love that could never breathe. Grief for a future that would never be explored. Grief for an intimacy that existed only in the emotional realm. This grief had no outlet. It couldn't be shared, explained, or validated. It existed in isolation, compounding with time. And as it grew, it began to change the way the heart experienced the world. Other connections felt thinner by comparison. Other interactions lacked depth. The heart wasn't withdrawing from life. It was conserving energy for something it couldn't fully have. This made everything else feel slightly out of reach, slightly less meaningful. This is how silent love isolates. Not by pulling you away from people, but by anchoring part of you somewhere you cannot fully inhabit. You remain present in the world, but emotionally divided. Part of you lives in the connection, even if that connection exists largely within you. Over time, the silence began to ache, not sharply but persistently. A dull, constant pressure that reminded the heart of what it was holding back. The ache surfaced in unexpected ways, in fatigue, in irritability, in moments of sadness that seemed unconnected to anything specific. This was the body carrying emotional weight the mind refused to release. And with that ache came a terrifying realization. Loving in silence was no longer sustainable. The heart could continue to contain the love, but containment was beginning to feel like erosion. Slowly, steadily, it was wearing away emotional resilience. The effort of holding back was becoming heavier than the fear of consequence. This was the threshold, the point where silence stops being protective and starts being harmful. The point where love demands acknowledgement, not necessarily from the other person, but from the self. And in that recognition, another truth emerged, one that the heart had been avoiding since the beginning. This love was not only unmet, it was unsustainable. Something would have to change. Either the love would be released, or it would be revealed. Either the heart would let go, or it would step into the consequences it had spent so long avoiding. There was no third option. And yet, standing at this emotional crossroads, the heart hesitated. Not because it didn't know what it wanted, but because it knew what it would lose either way. Because once silence is broken, even internally, there is no return to innocence. And this love, once acknowledged fully, would demand a price far greater than the heart had ever intended to pay. There comes a moment in every unmet love when endurance turns into strain. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but gradually, like a structure that has held weight for too long and begins to creak under pressure. This was that moment, the point where holding on and letting go both felt equally unbearable. The heart had reached its limit, not the limit of affection, but the limit of containment. The quiet discipline that once felt noble now felt suffocating. What had been framed as restraint began to resemble self-erasure. The love had grown too large to remain hidden without consequence, and the cost of silence was no longer theoretical. It was being paid daily. The weight showed up everywhere, in emotional exhaustion that lingered even after rest, in moments of sadness that arrived without warning, in a growing sense of disconnection from a life that existed outside the unspoken bond. The heart was tired of managing itself, managing longing, managing restraint, managing the constant internal negotiation between desire and responsibility. There was no relief in either direction. To lean into the love felt reckless. To continue denying it felt cruel. And so the heart existed in a state of suspended tension, pulled between two truths it could no longer reconcile. This was when the love stopped feeling gentle. It didn't lose its tenderness, but it gained urgency. The quiet steadiness that once defined it began to carry an undercurrent of desperation. Not for action, but for resolution. The heart didn't necessarily want the love to be acted upon. It wanted clarity. It wanted an end to ambiguity. It wanted to stop existing in a state of emotional limbo. Limbo is where love goes to suffer. In limbo, hope doesn't die, but it can't live either. It hovers, undefined and unresolved, draining energy without offering direction. And the longer it lasts, the more it distorts perception. The heart begins to misinterpret signals, to assign meaning where there may be none, to search desperately for confirmation or closure. This was when the fear shifted. At first, the fear had been about discovery, about what would happen if the love was exposed. Now, The fear was about invisibility, about what would mean if the love was real but never acknowledged, never recognized, never mirrored. The heart began to wonder if it had imagined everything, if the connection was one-sided, if the depth was asymmetrical, if the silence meant absence rather than restraint. These doubts were more painful than longing itself, because longing at least affirmed that something existed. Doubt threatened to erase it entirely, and the idea that this love might exist only within a heart that carried it was almost unbearable. This uncertainty amplified everything. Every moment of emotional distance felt like rejection. Every moment of closeness felt like hope, and the constant oscillation between the two left the heart raw and unguarded. It was no longer possible to pretend this love was harmless. It was shaping emotional well-being. It was influencing mood, focus, and self-perception. It had become a central emotional reference point, something the heart measured itself against, even as it pretended otherwise. This was the dangerous truth of it. The love had become significant enough to matter deeply, but not secure enough to feel safe. And love that is significant without safety is destabilizing. There were moments now when the heart fantasized, not about outcomes, but about endings, about what would feel like to finally let go, to step away emotionally, to reclaim the parts of itself that had been quietly invested elsewhere. But even that imagined release carried grief, because letting go would not be neutral. It would not be clean. It would feel like tearing away something that had become part of emotional identity. The love wasn't just an attachment. It was a lens through which the world had been experienced for some time now. Removing it would change everything. And yet, keeping it meant continuing to shrink around it, to organize life in ways that accommodated a love that could never fully exist. This was the paradox. The love could not be lived, but it could also not be ignored. So the heart did the only thing it could. It began to break quietly, not all at once, not in visible ways, but in small internal fractures. A little less patience here, a little more sadness there, a growing sense of emotional fatigue that had no clear source. This breaking was subtle enough to be overlooked, but cumulative enough to be dangerous. The heart began to lose its sense of emotional grounding. Joy felt fleeting. Purpose felt blurred. Everything felt slightly off, as though life was being lived from a distance rather than inhabited fully. And somewhere within that disorientation, a final realization emerged, clear, undeniable, and terrifying in its simplicity. This love was asking for a choice. Not a dramatic decision, not an external declaration, but an internal commitment to one of two paths. Either the heart would continue sacrificing itself for the sake of preserving connection, or it would prioritize its own survival, even if that meant letting the love go unfinished. This was no longer about what was right or wrong. It was about what was possible. And what was becoming painfully clear was that the heart could not carry this love much longer without losing something essential in the process. The moment had arrived where something would have to be surrendered, either the love or the self. And standing on that edge, the heart finally understood why this love was never meant to be found. Because finding it required a strength that could only be forged through loss. There is a difference between heartbreak and self-preservation, though in the moment they feel indistinguishable. Both require letting go. Both demand surrender. But only one allows you to remain whole afterward. This was a distinction the heart was finally forced to confront. The choice had been made quietly, not in a single decisive moment, but through a series of small internal recognitions that accumulated into certainty. The heart could no longer sustain a love that required it to disappear in order to survive. No matter how profound the connection felt, no matter how rare or meaningful it seemed, it had begun to cost too much. This was not the kind of love that destroyed loudly. It destroyed slowly. It eroded boundaries. It thinned emotional resilience. It asked for endurance without offering refuge. And that was when the heart understood something essential. Love that cannot be lived openly will eventually ask you to live partially. The decision to let go was not dramatic. There was no sudden clarity, no emotional release. It was marked instead by grief that felt heavy but resolved, sorrow that carried purpose. This was not the grief of losing something taken away. It was a grief of choosing to put something down. Choosing loss is different. It means acknowledging that something beautiful exists, while also accepting that beauty alone is not enough to justify its cost. It means honoring the connection without allowing it to consume what remains of the self. The heart began to withdraw, not externally, but internally. It loosened its grip on expectation. It stopped interpreting meaning into silence. It allowed moments to pass without clinging to them. This withdrawal was painful, but it was also stabilizing. For the first time in a long while, emotional energy began to return to places it had quietly abandoned. The world slowly regained depth outside the orbit of the love. Other connections began to feel accessible again, not as replacements, but as reminders that life existed beyond the unspoken bond. Still, the love did not vanish. It lingered like a memory that refuses to fade, not intrusive, but persistent. The heart didn't try to erase it. Erasure would have been dishonest. Instead, it acknowledged the love for what it was: real, formative, and incomplete. Incomplete loves leave the deepest marks, not because they fail, but because they remain open-ended. They live in imagination, in emotional muscle memory, in the quiet knowledge of what could have been if circumstances had aligned differently. And that knowledge hurt. There were moments when the heart questioned itself, moments when longing resurfaced, when restraint felt unnecessarily cruel, when the idea of enduring just a little longer seemed tempting. But those moments were met with a steadier truth, one forged through exhaustion rather than impulse. Endurance without fulfillment is not strength. It is slow self-abandonment. And so the heart held its course. It began redefining love, not as intensity, but as alignment, not as depth alone, but as reciprocity, safety, and possibility. This redefinition didn't diminish what had been felt. It contextualized it. It allowed the love to exist without being allowed to dominate. There was a quiet dignity in this choice. No one else saw it. No one else acknowledged it, but it was profound nonetheless. Letting go did not mean forgetting. It meant carrying the love differently, as something that had awakened emotional awareness, as something that had revealed capacity for depth, as something that had taught the heart about its own limits. The ache remained, but it softened. It became less about wanting and more about remembering, less about absence and more about gratitude for having felt something real, even if it could not be kept. This was a paradox the heart finally accepted. Some loves enter your life not to stay, but to show you who you are capable of becoming. This love had done that. It had expanded emotional range. It had sharpened self-awareness. It had forced a reckoning with boundaries, values, and self-worth. And in doing so, it had served its purpose. There was peace in this understanding. Not happiness, not relief, but peace. The kind that comes from choosing wholeness over longing, integrity over intensity. The heart had chosen itself. And while the love would always exist in some quiet corner of memory, it no longer demanded center stage. It had been honored, acknowledged, and finally released. Only one chapter remained, not of the love itself, but of what comes after, of who the heart becomes once the love it was never meant to find has been laid to rest. There is a strange silence that follows the end of something profound, not the kind of silence that echoes with absence, but the kind that settles gently, like dust after a long disturbance. This was the silence that remained after the love had been laid down, not discarded, not denied, but finally given a place where it could no longer wound. Life did not change dramatically. The days continued in their familiar rhythm. Responsibilities remained. Conversations flowed as they always had. To the outside world, nothing looked different, but internally, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. The heart felt lighter, not because it had lost less, but because it was no longer carrying what it could not hold. For the first time in a long while, emotional energy moved freely again. It was no longer tethered to anticipation or restraint. Thoughts no longer returned compulsively to the same emotional center. The quiet vigilance that had once defined every interaction faded, replaced by a steadier awareness of self. This was not indifference. It was integration. The love had not been erased. It had been absorbed into experience. It had become part of the emotional architecture, rather than an active force demanding attention. And in that integration, the heart found something unexpected: clarity. Clarity about what love should feel like. Not hidden, not constricted, not dependent on silence to survive. The heart understood now that real love expands life rather than narrowing it, that it invites openness instead of requiring concealment, that it strengthens identity rather than fragmenting it. This understanding did not come from theory. It came from contrast, from having loved deeply in a way that required constant restraint, and recognizing how much of the self had been withheld in the process, from realizing that intensity alone is not enough, that sustainability, safety, and mutual presence mattered just as much. The memory of the love remained tender. There were still moments when it surfaced unexpectedly, a familiar emotional echo, a quiet recognition triggered by nothing in particular. But these moments no longer destabilized the heart. They were met with calm acknowledgement rather than longing. The love had become a teacher. It taught the heart how deeply it could feel. It taught it where its boundaries lived. It taught it the difference between connection and compatibility. And perhaps most importantly, it taught the heart that not every love is meant to be lived in the world to be real. Some loves exist to shape us privately, to refine emotional awareness, to deepen empathy, to prepare us for connections that can be fully claimed when the time is right. This love was one of those. There was gratitude now. Quiet, sincere gratitude for having encountered something that awakened the heart rather than numbing it, for having experienced a connection that was meaningful even in its incompletion. And there was forgiveness. Forgiveness for the heart's initial confusion. Forgiveness for the longing that overstayed its welcome. Forgiveness of the time spent trying to make something work that was never designed to last. The heart did not regret the love. Regret would have diminished its significance. Instead, it honored it as a chapter that had ended exactly when it needed to, because staying longer would not have deepened the love. It would have diminished the self, and leaving, though painful, preserved both. This was the final truth the heart carried forward. Just because a love feels profound does not mean it is meant to be permanent. Some loves are found not to be kept, but to be understood. Understood as mirrors, as lessons, as quiet turning points in the emotional narrative of a life. And so the heart moved forward, not unchanged, but refined. Not hardened, but wiser. Not closed, but more discerning. It carried the love with it, not as a wound, but as a reminder that it loved fully, even when it had chosen to let go. A reminder that it had chosen itself without bitterness. A reminder that strength sometimes looks like release rather than pursuit. This was what remained, not emptiness, not loss, but a deeper capacity for love that could one day be found again, this time in a form that would not require silence to survive. And in that quiet resolution, the heart finally understood. The love that was never meant to be found had fulfilled its purpose the moment it taught the heart how to let go without losing itself. And so, some loves are never meant to be found, yet they leave marks we carry forever. They teach us, they shape us, and they remind us that letting go is sometimes the truest form of love. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Like, comment, and share your thoughts below. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next chapter of love, heartbreak, and the whispers we never speak is just around the corner.